We usually start just to let people know about 2 minutes after, so we give everybody welcome you to the ENCLAVE series. And it's great to see many people returning, and it's great to see people that we recognize, and it's great to see people that are new to our series. This is our second fall ENCLAVE, and we're looking forward to hearing from Cole Swenson. The list of upcoming readers includes next week, Carla Harriman, Erica Hunt. Each of these are on Sunday afternoon. Rodrigo Toscano. Next Sunday, Susan Gewirtz, followed by Monica Yoon, Charles Alexander, Liz Willis, and lately Long Soldier. So doing the introduction of Cole Swenson today is Ray Armentrout, the co-organizer of ENCLAVE. And just a couple of words about Ray, which you may know. Most recently, her book Wobble was a finalist for the National Book Award. Since then, she's published Conjure, which just came out from Wesleyan. Versed in 2009, won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award in 2010. So, great.
Thank you, Jean. But we're here to talk about Cole Swenson. First, some of the facts. Cole Swenson has published 17 volumes of poetry, including most recently On Walking On from Nightboat Press, Gravesend from University of California Press, Gave from Omnidon, and Ghost from Alice James Books, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. Art and Time, a collection of hybrid lyric writing on landscape art, is coming out from Nightboat in 2021. Cole is also a preeminent translator of contemporary French poetry and art criticism. She won the PEN USA Award for Literary Translation in 2004. She is the founding editor of Presse Books, which specializes in contemporary French letters in translation. Speaking of editing, Cole is the co-editor with David St. John of the Norton anthology, American Hybrid. Her collection of critical essays, Noise That Stays Noise, came out from University of Michigan in 2011. She divides her time between Paris and Providence, Rhode Island, where she is professor in the literary arts program at Brown University. So, how can I talk about Cole's work? Each of her books is a kind of journey. Swenson herself is often in motion, whether on foot or on a train, in a museum, or in an archive. She is a poet of what can be seen and what can be said about it, neither of which she takes for granted. She's interested in what light does to surfaces, but also in the liminal spaces where shadows, illusions, and ghosts appear. It is fitting that in her book Ghost, a title in which we can't help but hear the word ghost, the middle section is a history of the incandescent, where we find fugitive fragments of writings documenting such things as the invention of the night watch, presumably to keep a watch and a lookout for ghosts and such, the invention of the street light, the invention of the mirror, the invention of etched, engraved, and incised glass, etc. This middle section, flirting as it does with fact and history, is framed on either side by sections called Of White and On White, devoted to the ephemeral, the fugitive, the illusory. For instance, a group of white cities, one made of talc, one of chalk, one of sugar that melts in the sun. The tension between the recording of fact and the shifting of phenomena in Ghost appears in many of Cole's books, including Gave, which traces the history of the river Gave in France as it travels from the Spanish border to the Atlantic and from the past into the present. The book uses historical records to document the river's bridges, dikes, and floods, but it also meditates on the way a river escapes, overflows all possible description or definition. As Swensen puts it, a river is slippage. Language also is slippage here. It's a river longer sideways than its description. River courses change, several miles slightly off center. It took centuries of falling. Most rivers are not actually flowing, but falling. The length of themselves times the sun. That was a quote. One could say that Swensen's books document the limits of documentation, how description overflows its banks. I'll end by sharing a personal memory of a jaunt I made with Cole. Memory being what it is, she may not remember this or may remember it differently. Anyway, somewhere, probably in New York City, we went at her suggestion to a show of Bonnard's paintings. And I remember the way she drew attention to the edges of the paintings and how the scenes seemed to extend beyond or overflow the frame. So today I can't wait to hear what Cole Swenson will read. Cole?
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for coming and being here. I am thrilled to be a part of this series with so many really wonderful writers. And thank you, Jean and Ray, for inviting me and for including my work. I'd also like to thank you for giving us all something wonderful to look forward to every single week throughout this really isolating time. Really, really appreciate that. I'd like to acknowledge that I am reading from unceded lands of the coastal Miwok people just north of San Francisco. And I'm going to be reading today from Art in Time. So there are 5 to 7 minute excerpts of a variety of essays that focus on artists who look at landscape from a way that kind of keeps it in motion and that recognizes our participation in it. So I'm going to introduce the whole thing by reading a couple of paragraphs from the introduction to the collection. A substantial body of Western landscape theory written over the past 30 plus years has critiqued the genre's reinforcement of binaries such as inside-outside, subject-object, and culture-nature. Such binaries are part of the ideological apparatus through which landscape art can reduce a complex network of animal, vegetal, and mineral interactions to a static ornament, reinforcing a sense of human power over nature, imposing specific cultural values, and/or claiming or exercising control. Such an approach projects human interests and desires so thoroughly that they effectively anthropomorphize the world, subjugating its non-human elements to humans' will to turn the world to our uses and/or reflect our domination of and imagined separation from the natural world. And yet, throughout the centuries, various artists have taken quite different approaches, implicitly or explicitly advocating relationships with the earth based on collaboration rather than domination, conversation rather than control. The poem essays in the book all look at artists whose work recognizes nature not as the other of culture, not as something out there, but as an intimate and active engagement, encouraging an increased participation in, and thus a reciprocal relationship with the earth. And just a note, in almost all of the essays, there are 1 or 2 quotes by the artists themselves. And though there are some exceptions, for the most part, they're the lines that include the first person singular, I. Okay, so now I'm going to try and do that share screen thing. There we go. Okay. The first piece is an excerpt from a piece on Joan Jonas, one of the first people to work in performance art and video. She had a major retrospective in 2018 at the Tate Modern, and there is now an entire room devoted to her work in the newly redone New York MoMA. This piece is on a video titled Merlot, which means blackberry. Blackberry means blackbird in Italian. Joan Jonas, Merlot. In a landscape almost entirely wind, a woman veiled head to toe in dark cloth, standing on a balustrade in Tuscany, grainy, black and white video from the mid-1970s, the veil constantly replaced by wind, silhouetting the body in mercury. She was the first artist to use live video in her work, sometimes paralleling her performances with live feed as mercury into the trees, into a migration of displacements profiled against drift, which makes it into a pilgrimage, patches of mist rising in the valley behind her. Her body is often at the center of her work, but it's never autobiographical, so she's invulnerable. Patches of mist are somehow essential to the blackbird at the heart of the piece. Merlot, Merlot. Move. There we go. At the heart of the emerging genre of performance art in New York at the end of the 1960s, she saw a link between that and the equally emergent women's movement. The woman is tall across the broad valley, across the dark field full of blackbirds somewhere farther back there, under the trees, full. And though in fact birds appear throughout her work, here there's no bird in sight, though dogs bark, drawing the evening out into a dark that carves into things that slip from thing to hand to chance. I didn't see a major difference between a poem, a sculpture, a film, or a dance. Sometimes the birds are simply drawn. Sometimes they remain alone. She often draws without looking at the paper, keeping her eyes instead on the model, somewhere farther back there, the barking dogs, out of sight to the left, haunting an echo that creates a third dimension within the screen. The barking continues to make its own rhythm a part of the night. I used to work only at night. Did the sound carry over water? We know that a river runs down there in the valley. Merlot, Merlot, black among its wing. Among the animals throughout her work, haunting an echo of mythology and fairy tale, every animal is, in fact, its own myth, hauling centuries along inside it. And every dog is, in fact, also a path. And the barking, a gong, as a crowd, as a shroud, hidden in rain. Ritual, choreography, and mirroring are elements that she has insistently foregrounded throughout the last 50 years. And then there's the wind, a ritualistic choreography of mirrors in its own right, and how the wind turns to night by making the road its own, in the lone road that the woman on the balustrade watches run. It was not there before. It's the barking of the dogs that we call home. Wind, 1968, her first film and her first work made outdoors. Wind whips across a beach on Long Island covered in snow. Wind further makes the river, flying over the bird in black against a background that must once have been in color. Juxtaposition also plays a central role in her compositions, the dramatic shift creating a rift through which new animals slip, patches of mist rising to find them. When seen, the dogs are white, but this is years later, and they are heading off somewhere else, which is, for them, a precise location. Herding all waters, herding all verges, a pastoral economy depends upon affection to ensure the safety of its everything wandering. If a woman, for instance, walks across a river, if a road follows her, if a bird and a dog become increasingly apart, and if we see ourselves also as inextricable, would we reach for the bird or for the dog? The barking becomes a vehicle carrying us farther and farther into the background. She works as much outside as in, shying away from the word nature, replacing it with that of distance, and the dogs barking within it. And barking again, it's Tuscany in spring, the bells turned inside out. Watch a woman on a stone railing, carefully. A river at the bottom of a valley finds itself a bird on a balustrade. The sound of the outdoors, I consider how sound is delayed. A woman is calling across a river. She's waiting for an answer. How is a bird distilled to thin air? And in what other forms will the dogs appear? We stay out late on the terrace overlooking the valley, late enough that the mist has taken on a life. A bird on a balustrade, a simple stone ornament on a simple stone construction, on which one might lean an elbow or pose a fan folded to fool the wind. This next piece is on a work titled Lighthouse in a Sea of Time by the Algerian installation and video artist Zineb Sedira. The piece was part of a major exhibition on her work at the Jeu de Paume in Paris in 2019. She'll be representing France at the Venice Biennale in 2022. Zineb Sedira, Lighthouse in a Sea of Time, Part 1, Video Installation. The piece opens at night with an oddly bright amber bird flying by against dark hills. This first part of the work consists of 4 screens on which moving images of short duration are intermittently projected. The bird appears on the screen in the lower right. The 4 screens often show echoes, often larger details of other screens, just slightly offset in time and scale. Another bird passes and then is enlarged on the screen to the left, at which point we see that, in fact, it's actually a patch of light rippling across the facing cliff at regular intervals. Images flow and juxtapose across the screens. Sometimes all are occupied at once, sometimes only 1 or 2 or 3. And then it's dawn, very calm, with clouds building up out to sea. A chain link fence runs down to the shore with a bird perched on almost every pole. Cap Caxine Lighthouse, built in 1868 along the coast just outside Algiers. Then the images shift to the Cap Sigli Lighthouse, built in 1906 along an uninhabited stretch of coast about 100 miles away. Its light shines 25 miles out to sea. From that high up, you can see far down the coast and the endless waves, the rhythm of days. Another dawn, someone flicks a curtain open across a brilliant window, all wrist. Another window, this one spotted with rain, is echoed on the screen by rain now running down in streams, while on the next, the camera backs up to give us a longer shot of the storm blowing through the trees, followed by the pale shadow of parallel bars gliding across a pale wall because another window that we can't see is opening. Or it's evening, seen through the rotating panes of the lamp and its shadow cast and seeking a place to land. And then the scale shrinks, and we're looking at a pair of binoculars with French windows reflected in one of the lenses. And then the lighthouse, seen from land through a lacework of barren branches. A white boat passes offshore. It's the only time we see a vessel out at sea, which seems ironic, as, of course, boats and ships are the only reasons that a lighthouse exists. There are 27 lighthouses along Algeria's 750-mile coastline, all with their keepers, all focused on the night. For that, of course, is when a lighthouse comes alive. Part 2, The Life of a Lighthouse Keeper, video projection. It's a job that, in much of the world, is now handled remotely and automatically. So in this project, Zineb Sedira is also documenting a disappearing way of life, in which we see that many of the fragmentary sequences that make up part 1 are either extracts or outtakes from this filmed interview with Karim Outramach, known as Cremo, now in his early 50s, who's been a lighthouse keeper at Cap Sigli since 2005. His story is striking. Having, when times were tough, taken to camping in a small stone hut below the Cap Sigli lighthouse, he began wondering about the life of the lighthouse keepers, and after much observation, decided that it was absolutely a dream. And so it became his dream. And though the details of the story are not given in the film, he did, in fact, become one of the keepers of the Cap Sigli lighthouse. We're in the presence of a man who is, I want to say, happy, but that's too frivolous a term. This is a man who has arrived at what he calls paradise. He's a painter and often spends the entire morning drawing and then paints at night, and a fisherman when the sea is calm. His boat is blue, the same blue as the sky and as the shutters and doors of the building where they live. I will never move out of the Cap Sigli lighthouse. He speaks of the peace and of the wild landscape that he feels is a part of him. I will never leave here because I am here, in the sense that it is what rather than where I am. Cremo, washing the huge windows of the lantern room, his sweeping gestures over the glass, a kind of choreographed semaphore, which is indeed a signaling, but this time inward, in toward the great lamp. The cleaner the windows, the farther the light. And the next piece is on the work of the 19th century French painter Rosa Bonheur. Arguably the best-known painter of her time, she was an outspoken, even vehement advocate of women's rights, lived in domestic partnerships with other women all her life, and in her art focused exclusively on animals and their environments. Rosa Bonheur, Animals with Landscape. Ruskin compared her to a zookeeper. All her life, she lived with the animals that she painted: hares, horses, huge bulls, the sun filtering through the leaves, the gold falling on all sides, washing over the face, the gold on the hooves, or the pristine paths of snow through Fontainebleau, marked only by the passage of deer. Looking there, the eye drawing back the leaves, the eye drawing bare trees. On the one hand, Rosa Bonheur literally animated the landscape with the animals that she loved, while on the other, the larger, she often masked it. The big, shaggy bodies of two rams, for instance, covering at least 3/4 of the canvas, rendering invisible the river in the distance and the distance along with it. Or a line of oxen blocking out the world, except that, of course, they are the world, telling Ruskin that she didn't want to paint every hair on the hide. Even a photograph wouldn't do that. Every hair of her gazelle, of her mouflon, of her chamois, of her yak, her wild boar, squirrel, and eagle, and all were usually plural, her cats. She captured their expressions so precisely because she believed that the glance gives away the soul, and that they gave theirs freely. The ferrets, lizards, foxes, and parrots, and sometimes a person or two, usually Natalie. Rosa Bonheur lived her entire adult life with her childhood friend, Natalie Micas, also a painter, and Micas's mother, Henriette, all of them equally determined to relever la femme. She had the gift of being close and to almost everything at once, though her favorites were the sheep, up to 50 at a time. 1850, in the Pyrenees, admiring the grandiose savagery of the mountains from the back of a horse that she and Natalie shared. You have no idea how hard it was not to bring back a couple of goats. On a later trip, in 1853, they did bring back an otter who would often get into the house and join Henriette in bed. In 1860, she bought the Chateau de Bie near Fontainebleau with its own forest, the light barely making its way through the overlapping layers of overlapping leaves. Studies of trees and of the structure of light, the tiny grains that dust all over things, and the fragile sound as they settle on stone. Rosa Bonheur, pink happiness, the joy of the flower, calling her stag Jacques, her lioness Fatma, her boar Kiki, and so on. Bonheur's animals are never metaphoric, never symbolic, always simply distinct individuals with proper names. The power of that particularity dominates her work. For instance, the horses in The Horse Fair, 1853, with their coiled musculature that practically cracks the canvas, the violence inherent, could be considered a displacement of her own rebellious spirit, except for the individual expression in each horse's face, which instead suggests acute observation and a grasp of the irreducible actuality of each. And there's a connection between her interest in raising up the state of women and her recognition of the souls and individualities of animals, as, of course, in 19th century France, both animals and women were entirely at the mercy of men. Often loved, yes, often deeply valued, but with a love and appreciation that could be revoked at any time and that did not suffer the need to be requited. Which may also be related to her increasing drift beyond the domestic, animals largely separate from the human sphere. Herd of deer in a forest, 1898, the year before she died, each one looking in a slightly different direction, while one looks directly at her, not seeming to mind her presence. In countless studies in pencil, doves, fawns, still alive in their lines. Much later, after the Franco-Prussian War, it was lions. She had 5 in all, though not all at once, which amounted to a complex confluence of the domestic and the wild. Hers, thoroughly the latter, hers had all been transformed into the former, and mostly they didn't live very long, but they lived peacefully, affectionately, padding softly around the house and grounds, terrifying the guests. The next piece is on the drawings of Renee Gladman, a contemporary writer who first became well-known in relation to new narrative. She has since developed a strong practice as a visual artist. The drawings that I'll be showing are from a series titled Plans for Sentences, which will be published as a sequel to her 2017 book, Prose Architectures. Renee Gladman, Axemic Cities. A city in the distance is always something toward which. A city in the distance is always rising up against, and rising within is always a city whose name is always on the tip, recalibrating the angle of the hand poised over the paper. The hand puts down the pen and goes off to make a cup of tea, while the distance of the city only increases, the distance between the hand and its own semantic possibilities. Renee Gladman's drawings could be anything, but they happen to be cities. They are vertical cities, built of sheer ascension, ascending across great expanses, and still expanding, hand over hand, the intricate fingership, gestured an acrobat, and executed with a newly sharpened needle, most often in pencil, 0.5 millimeter or 0.38. I like the kind where you can take off the end and sharpen the point, to a diamond tip, which can cut through pretty much anything, including a diamond, embedded in the graphite, the finest scintillations of all the lighted windows receding across a plain. It was a city moving away, called by others, to which it was linked through an intricate network of threaded silence emanating from late streetlights and the darkness hurrying in, getting closer and closer to the shadow of a walker who, beneath a wash of ink, occupied it all so that the shadow could think. Gladman refers to buildings as other kinds of beings, also thinking. Thinking takes the shape of buildings, that only architecture creates the possibility of coming in. The entire west wall of Gladman's studio is a bank of greenhouse windows through which sunlight washes in and across the paper, across which precise characters migrate themselves into habitable structures. We came into the first city after a long walk across a bright plain fired with sand and sun. And so to come across an entire city built of rungs of carbon spun with hematite, the delicate stairs, almost all of them spiral, the bridges fragile and aerial, spanning from tower to tower, at times disappearing into solid marble cliffs, and from there through room after room, lit only by sunlight infusing the walls, paper thin. As Gladman says, architecture, again, it always comes back to that. Entire countries in which there is nothing not arcing or texturing in a crystalline accrual. We wait for the salts to bind, and the tiniest bird, perfectly worded, breaks through the fine facade. And the next piece is on the landscape work of Chaim Soutine, a Russian painter who became a principal participant in the School of Paris, the international arts group that was based in central Paris throughout the first part of the 20th century. He's widely known for his portraits of cafe workers and bakers and hanging sides of beef in the markets of Paris, but a substantial and much less known part of his work was devoted to landscape. Chaim Soutine, Reeling Trees. The children are lost is the central fact, and that is what holds on, what factors in and what losing is, how its moving parts come together with that clicking sound. How are we a product of wind? Everything here is 4 paintings by Chaim Soutine hanging in a single room, though of only 2 scenes, 2 of large trees and 2 of 2 children running home. We see them at 2 different points on their road, where the capacious sky backs up, fills with trees, huge trees, full of wind that we can see, warm wind along the road that curves behind them, beyond the curve, where a world which he built from paint, painted over paint, breaks out into a world just barely out of sight. It opens out into a broad valley dotted with majestic oaks, alone in great fields of horses in a storm. The children are on their way home. Clarice Nicodisi said that Soutine is the painter who made the wind visible. In the curve of a feeling, as he put it, feeling always curves sharply toward, having been raised in a tradition that prohibited representation, he chose self-exile, in which the line is drawn before it's formed. He arrived in Paris in 1913 and went to stay with friends at La Ruche with its affordable studio housing built from the ruins of the most recent Universal exhibition. Soutine was a great reader of Montaigne, who claimed that the world is constantly churning, never achieving equilibrium. And so Soutine's riotous slippages multiply, and the viewer, too, slips, skids, and the trees reel overhead. Landscape with Person, or The White Road, 1918-19. We're falling up a hill, still, as the light shines, through climbing branches that hold a house up to the sky. As the road divides, as the cliff falls, as the sky falls, and the road flays, and the world tilts red where it isn't walking along a road thrown farther up, as we pick our way down the red cliff, running in the sun. Or more slowly, wandering under light, sharpening, the light making color come off on the hands. And sometimes the hands are larger than life, and always the hands, living on their own. Waiting for the wind to rise, he said to a friend who, passing again hours later, found him sitting in exactly the same position. And then it did. Landscape near Serres, 1920. If the house entered the wind, or rather, if the wind is, in fact, or becomes the windows, or in what order wind and house arrange themselves, there is a shroud to find, or lace, or veil at times, the whole town wearing out, wearing down to the face of the animal, beginning to show through the procession of white walking out of itself, not as violent as one would have thought, or it was not the wind. Soutine painted some 200 landscapes around Serres in the 3 years he spent there between 1919 and 1922. His first dealer, Zaborowski, took him down to the south to give him the time and the means to paint. First to Cagnes, just west of Nice, but Soutine was restless and so moved on to Serres, a small town just above the Spanish border, some 20 miles from the sea. Many of the landscapes are towns and many others are trees. For instance, the oak, circa 1939, which is mostly sun, and the tree, also 1939, with houses the size of marbles somewhere down below. Is a painting of a tree, a landscape, or a portrait? He painted so aggressively that one day he dislocated his thumb. And the next piece is an excerpt from a project done by the uncategorizable artists, though they're often linked with land art, Christo and Jean-Claude. The project was staged just north of where I am now on Coast Miwok land, about an hour north of San Francisco. In reading this extract and the next one on Agnes Varda, I particularly wanted to thank these two great artists who've recently died, Christo on May 31 of this year and Varda on March 29, 2019. Christo and Jean-Claude, The Running Fence. Like the tied back curtain to a summer window, said the Tamales Bay Times, while the Environmental Impact Report compared it to a county fair, a flare, an unfurl that flew, a kite 25 miles in flight, ignited by the sun. How did the birds respond, especially the raptors and vultures who spend their lives riding the currents of air, showing that the atmosphere is also constructed of hills, slopes, curves, valleys, moving not unlike the fence in its slow streak of geographic sweep, a lighthouse drawn with a long phosphorescent brush. What did it look like in the moonlight? What did it look like from the moon? And then suddenly, all the animals for miles around awake, making a thin line drawn in lime, arrive at a great wall that walled nothing in. It took 4 years of fighting authorities at all levels, individual, local, county, state, and federal, to get the permission. One of the recurrent complaints was extravagance, millions of dollars for what most people found hard to call art. But all those millions were earned by someone, from engineers to drivers to ranchers, who all contributed to its creation, and many of them were local. It created a small economic boom in the region. The 4 years of negotiation were above all about getting the agreement of the community, and it was a community that the project built by bringing them all together around the work. In short, the community that was created by creating the art was a central element of that art. It didn't make it, it was it, including even the people who opposed it. If you were there at all, you couldn't not be a part of it. You played a role in the continually unspooling theater, and in that way, their work is completely realist. The only beginning or end the project had was temporal, and that was absolute and embedded in its very title. Running Fence, Sonoma and Marin Counties, California, 1972 to 76. It began when they first got the idea, and it ended only once every trace of it had been removed by October 31, 1976. All of Christo and Jean-Claude's projects have an elaborate ephemerality at the core. Endless effort spent on a glance. A glimpse, one said, centers the eye's corner. I was driving by, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flight fly. And I too used to fly, said the rancher with a newborn calf in his arms. For whole split seconds, it was the land that did it. Flight as extension, a connection that lets time touch time across time. Flight as a muscular memory lodged in muscles we no longer own. Or flight as a function of the eye, lifting the body beyond its possibility. or flight as an aberration of the eye in conjunction with an hallucination of the spine. Flight, we flew, and it was simply that. It's simply something that happens to a body in time. And it happened again and again. When I said that the fence flew, we flew, and so I said it again and again. How quick a streak might cause a heart, that a heart might see a quick streak take off from it, the heart, already thought out in light. It seems that the eye can't help but follow any bright extension, seems to leave all boundaries in shreds. There were moments, they said, when you couldn't even look at it, or you'd have a blind spot, or rather a long blinding blaze that stayed on, moving through your mind. If we think of the fence as exactly that, a blind spot of interminable length, a landscape of late summer equally struck, landscape of the late suddenly thinking, fence as frame. Walk we all in together again, walk the across, the fox, the deer, the sheep, the lost. The fence holds them all, not through containment, but like a magnet, the attraction of fact. 165,000 yards of woven white cloth, 2,050 poles, 90 miles of steel cable, 350,000 hooks, 59 ranchers whose land the fence needed to cross and who were at first so resistant. The countless visits to all of them until one handed him a beer and invited him in. There's an art to going back again and again, to the sooner or later you'll not only agree, but will become an advocate, will argue for the project in countless public meetings with city councils, county planning commissions, and people generally difficult. And in this way, relatively conservative ranchers became outspoken advocates of avant-garde art. In the long run, they ended up inadvertently functioning as museum guides, pointing out particularly striking perspectives, praising the aesthetics, and detailing the technical challenges that, once surmounted, made the whole thing fly. The fence is the gesture that changed the site from land into landscape. By placing a work of art in it, it's suddenly apparent. And you, writing out the museum label, list the materials, light, time, and weather, all the while thinking of the unidentifiable animal that you saw last night silhouetted against it. And this last piece is on the work of Agnes Varda, a filmmaker who's widely recognized as the initiator of French New Wave cinema. Agnes Varda, Here, There, and Then Now. Landscape through which runs a river, both sides lined with trees, slightly therefore flowing green. The bells strung between follow in slight distance, reflected on the panes of an orangerie. Landscape of evening shadowing the park. Landscape of ventriloquist in nearby pavilion. The landscape, the land itself a voice of silence coming through a white sheet thrown over a chair. Landscape of a sheet of sun made of bees. Varda often focused on people often unheard, vagabonds, gleaners, cleaners, shopkeepers, villagers, with landscape framing, even enabling character. Her last full-length film, Visage Village, with the face of the entire French countryside moving smoothly behind, the one thing that binds all these otherwise disparate faces and places. Landscape opening just like the faces, going pale in the pouring light of ripe wheat. Blanchisserie of all is summer, looking back in defiance of the camera. Landscape as history, looking back too quickly at history, working at right angles to memory. Landscape of history as the shade of an oak over a stream, oddly resembling a folded paper boat. Thank you. Out of here. There we go. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And I am going to unmute my co-host, or if she cannot unmute herself. Anyway, it was a fabulous, fabulous reading, Cole. And I loved many, many of your lines. And so I jotted many of them down, but I guess as one summary, I love the line, "Walk we across all together again." So let me see, I think I'm just not seeing Ray here. I don't.
Oh, I'm seeing Ray.
I am not seeing her in the participants, unfortunately. I'm up at the A's and down at the R's. And so there we go. There's ask to unmute.
Okay.
So Ray, there you go.
All right. Okay, that was beautiful, Cole. I love the stories about how Christo's Fence brought all of these farmers together and made them like art historians and museum guides. That was so great.
Yeah, and most of their projects, in one way or another, do that. They create a community that is a really central part of the art that they're doing, and so it's nice.